It's a tragedy. A tragedy so common that it has been with our civilization forever, and if we fail to fight it off even one time, that would be the end of human civilization itself. And it is so common that it could happen to any of us any day. If we don't think about it and deal with it, we will succumb to it. And so let's talk about it in this video. Budhanur is a small village in Kerala, along with the villages of Chenithala and Mannar. Dry tamarind, earthen bricks, smithies, coconut trees and paddies. The lives of thousands of people here are tied together by the Kuttamperu River. The 12-kilometer long and 100-meter wide river has supported countless generations along its banks until this century. It's 2005, and years of waste dumping, encroachment, the sand mafia, and all kinds of other human activities have shriveled this river down to merely 15 meters wide. It's also virtually devoid of life. Tragedy of the Commons. This is a term that was coined by Garrett Hardin in 1968 in an essay he wrote. Today, the Harvard Business School defines it as a situation in which individuals with access to a public resource act in their own interest and, in doing so, ultimately deplete the resource. Water in our rivers, the land we live and cultivate on, the air we breathe, and even social entities like libraries are shared resources. The tragedy of the commons is a story that can unfold anywhere in our society. And water continues to be a very good example of seeing it play out again and again. This is the Aral Sea. Before 1960, it was the fourth largest lake, and it even had big fishes like the sturgeon. I say was because, see, Aral Sea is fed primarily by two rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. But in the 1960s, the Soviets started an agricultural project where they engineered the water away from these rivers and used it to irrigate water-intensive crops like cotton and watermelon. And this project has been a great success. Those areas are now big exporters of watermelon and cotton and do very well when it comes to agriculture. But this is what has happened to the Aral Sea. The drying of the Aral Sea doesn't seem surprising today, does it, right? Like, you stop the flow of water, so of course the sea would shrink and dry up. And you know what? The Soviets actually expected that and were okay with it. See, back then it was considered acceptable for the Aral Sea, almost considered an unnatural water body, to just shrink away. And nobody expected there to be any significant harms or loss of anything. But the reason I'm talking about it today is because time has proven that wasn't the case. See, as the sea shrank, the water became more saline due to the concentration of the remaining sediment increasing in the less amount of water. That caused the fisheries to collapse. Also, some of the islands that were in the sea at one point were now accessible by land, almost exposed. But the Soviets had been using those islands, which were once isolated from the coast, for nuclear and testing of biological weapons like anthrax. And that sediment and those islands and that land was suddenly part of the coast. See, Uzbekistan has continued to farm cotton and benefit from that economy, but the loss of the fisheries and the resultant loss of irrigation and just the general way of life that came for the other people that lived on the coast of the Aral Sea, that can never come back. This is what the land looks like today. For the locals, the once thriving fishing and canning industry has just evaporated. Instead, they are left with anemia, high infant and maternal mortality, debilitating respiratory and intestinal ailments, and for those that live there, all they have now is a husk of a sea. Today, the Aral Sea is seen as a global tragedy, a common resource overexploited, the benefits of a few resulting in the tremendous loss of others. Garrett Hardin himself stressed on overpopulation leading to the tragedy of the commons as inevitable. Much of the conversation has always created a sense of inevitability, and that is true in a way that the human population will keep growing, and the more it grows, the more it demands, and eventually there will be a threshold. We cannot have an infinite number of humans on this planet and not kill off every resource. Many have refuted this phenomena, especially how inevitable it feels. The outlook completely disregarded the human ability for resource management and bottled human nature to its very negative and animalistic tendencies. Furthermore, the concept of overpopulation has always wrestled with racism, prejudice, and inequality. So while it is true and logical to say that the tragedy of the commons will occur and it is something we need to talk about, there needs to be a lot more nuance when we talk about it. Most of you would know and remember this.
I am inevitable.
Thanos saw it as his burden to reduce overpopulation across the universe to avoid the tragedy of the commons. See, this conversation has existed throughout culture and time because at the core is overexploitation and inequality. In fact, this is the very premise of climate change. The actions of a few on our common resources that are leading to the ill effects suffered by everyone else. So would that mean that the tragedy of the commons is truly as inevitable as Garrett Hardin proposed? Well, not really. The fact that humans have made it so far means that there is an alternative. Keeping all that in mind, I want to take another look at the Kutemperu River, because its story hasn't yet ended. In 2011, efforts were taken to start restoring the river. It started with about 7,000 villagers, spending 30,000 man-hours of labor spread across 2 months where they cleaned up the river manually. After that, for the next 5 years, another $1.5 million were spent buying up land adjacent to the banks so that the river could again be returned to its banks. Today, the river is teeming with life. It is no longer dead. Now, of course, it'll take a few more years before people can safely start consuming water from it and going about as they did almost a generation ago. But it is getting back. There are many ways to prevent misuse of a resource, and that is where the entire field of resource management comes in. Let's start with the most obvious, right? A resource has a benefit. If you take away the benefit, or actually cause a penalty of the same nature, it's not really as likely to be wasted. Take, for example, water again, drinking water, right? When it's scarce, it's expensive, and people waste it less. The key here, especially in our society, is monetary. When you put a price to a resource, it has value, and that makes it less likely to be wasted. We also have the ability to penalize waste and misuse of a resource in the form of penalties and fines. A lot of pollution is managed this way, and it prevents our common resources from being abused. Of course, if the penalty is not significant, then it is futile. It is a big reason why corporations and industries lobby the government to have these fines and regulations reduced, and it's also the reason why most of the Indian rivers remain polluted. Now, that is not to say that money is the solution to everything. Sometimes it's not, and there we need laws and regulations to step in and really just stop people from misusing a resource. The good one is wildlife, right? There is a lucrative black market, so poaching happens, and we've lost a lot of our biodiversity and wilderness to that. But that is not to say it's not effective. We also have the tool of sustainability, where we take a systems approach by tying the expenditure and waste back into the system so that it replenishes the value of the resource, and we can design it to do so for as long as we expect humans to be on this planet. The solutions we've spoken of so far are made out of institutions that can overcome human nature, and that is more of a counter to the tragedy of the commons, which itself, in a way, stems from human nature. It's a use of nature versus systems, but we can also work with human nature. See, there's an approach taken by the indigenous peoples around the world, as well as our own ancestors, creating values, creating cultural norms and practices that value our common resources. You can go anywhere in India and you will find rivers that are treated like goddesses, trees that have the souls of the local spirits, deities living in every little facet of nature. This is part of a tapestry that our ancestors created to guide our actions so that we can avoid the tragedy of the commons. So, while it may take effort and knowledge, sustainable resource management is a continuous effort that can be achieved through many different ways. And hence, the tragedy of the commons is not just a commentary on poor resource management leading to overexploitation, it's also a story of the failure of the human nature. It's an outcome that comes when knowledge, discipline, and love for your own people is overcome by self-interest and greed. So for a society to fail and destroy its own resources, it truly is a tragedy.